In his day, Giacomo Puccini was a superstar in the operatic world. He wrote these wonderful operas. And even if you're not an opera buff, you've heard of some of his great works. It was quite common to hear people in any great city whistling or humming one of the popular melodies that Puccini composed. From such great works as Tosca and La Boheme and Madame Butterfly. In his 60s, Puccini took on the challenge to compose what was to be his greatest accomplishment. The libretto, that's the melody, told the story of a gallant young man, Caliph, in his efforts to win the hand in marriage of a stern, mysterious, and seemingly cold Chinese princess named Turandot. Puccini labored for 4 years, but he was a very sick man, and he knew he was running out of time. Puccini died before his masterwork was completed, and his many friends, including a cadre of loyal students, couldn't bear the thought that their great master's greatest work would remain unfinished. Thus, they gathered together and completed it. In 1926, 2 years after his death, Puccini's greatest work, Turandot, was performed for the first time, appropriately enough, at Milan's La Scala Opera House, with Arturo Toscanini, the most famous conductor of the day, at the podium. When the opera reached the point where Puccini's work ended, Toscanini paused, set down the baton on the podium, and said, "Thus far the master wrote, but he died." And after a moment of silence, Toscanini again picked up his baton, turned to the audience, and with tears in his eyes said, "But his disciples finished his work." Thunderous applause was heard, of course. Why do I mention that bit of history? Well, in some important ways, Giacomo Puccini's life paralleled what our gospel reading is about. Christ was sent by God on a mission. Jesus came to show us how to lead good and holy lives and to get us closer to God. We know, however, that Jesus was unable to complete his mission. We don't know for sure, but we think his earthly ministry was only, some people say, 1.5 years or maybe 3 years while on this earth physically. There was much more work to be done. Thus, we hear in today's gospel, Jesus sent out his disciples 2 by 2 to do their best to complete their master's work. Jesus was quite clear. The harvest is rich, but the laborers are few. Beg the harvest master to send workers to the harvest. These disciples were sent out. Jesus knew what they needed, and he sort of gave them instructions, and so forth and so on. You know, one man once observed that just once he'd like to hear the word vocation from the pulpit as referring to a calling from God other than the calling to priesthood and religious life. Here is that time. Every Catholic has a vocation to be a minister of Christ. By that I mean to be a committed Catholic, to carry on the mission of Christ, so that all people will come to know God better. And how do we do that? Well, we don't have to go door to door like the Seventh-day Adventists do and try to convert people and so forth and so on. It seems to me the best thing you and I can do is to be so convinced of our faith that people can see it means something to us when they see us coming to church on the weekend, when they see us trying to fulfill what Christ wants us to do by our generosity. Here are examples of your generosity, by our kindness, by our concerns for others, by just being decent people. That's how we help finish the Master's work. I think that's an important element. Sure, the ordained priesthood is essential to the church. That can't be changed. But the Holy Spirit is calling us to be responsible members of the church, not leaving everything to the priest. And more in our culture, in our time, I mentioned last night, Father Joe Hoftemar and I are classmates at the seminary. We're the same age. The seminary training requires 8 years of college, so I knew Father Joe for those 8 years, got to know him as a good friend. I'm also a part of his barbershop quartet, by the way, too. We were called the Four Fathers. Wonderful experience. But I mention all of these things because, when Father Joe and I were ordained 51 years ago, we had 21 priests ordained for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. Imagine that, 21. Today, we're lucky if we get 3, maybe 4. And so more and more, we Catholics together have to finish the work of the Master, so to speak. And I think that definitely is the point of all of the readings today. And then, too, when you think about it, I also mentioned this, which is, it never occurred to me until recently when you thought about it. Those of you who are my age, you can remember in the 60s when we had the Second Vatican Council. Remember, before that time, the Mass was in Latin, and so forth and so on. Well, before the Vatican Council, the priests did everything. At Mass, you just kind of sat there or knelt there. Many people prayed their rosary. They didn't know what was going on. There was a little altar server, a little boy who would answer the prayers, but that was it. The lay people didn't have much to say. In fact, in the old Latin Mass, the people didn't even say the Our Father. The priest said that alone. And of course, there were no lay ministers to read the readings or distribute communion or do all the other things. Well, of course, that has changed drastically. Maybe God must have known what he was doing when the Pope convened the Second Vatican Council, because by God, we certainly need lay involvement in our church today. So you and I have a mission together to finish the work of the Master. That's what all of the readings tell us. St. Paul tells us that he bears the marks of the Lord on his body, in other words, his suffering, that sometimes it's difficult for us to be faithful Catholics. It might involve some sacrifice sometimes. And of course, by trying to do the best we can to complete the Master's work, the Gospel concludes saying that your names will be written in heaven. Wow. That's sort of encouraging, too. So that's what the readings mean today, and I think it's a very important message for all of us to do. Keep in mind.
Thank you for watching this week's homily here at St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. We invite you to join us for liturgy any weekend that you might be in the area. You can contact us at mysaintelizabeth.com or on Facebook. Thank you very much.